My name's Adele Goff and I'm the Adoption Support Development Manager for the National Adoption Service for Wales. We as a National Adoption Service commissioned AFKA Cymru to work with us to produce this e-learning module for health and education practitioners across Wales. You'll initially hear from Helen, who will talk more about the role of adoption in permanency planning, how it's delivered in Wales, and the early experiences of adopted children and how those affect them across their lifetime. Then I'll take over and I'll talk a bit more about the effects of trauma on the brain and how you can best support adopted children within your settings in a trauma-informed way. We know from the perspective of adopted children, young people and families that adoption-aware and trauma-informed services, especially in health and education, make a massive difference to their lives and outcomes.
I'm Helen Hawksworth and I'm a trainer consultant for AFKA Cymru, which is the Association of Fostering, Kinship and Adoption. And what we do as an organisation is we offer advice and training and consultancy to professionals and members of the public across the breadth of permanency planning for children. This recording will last about 1 hour 30 minutes, but we were really conscious there's a limit to the amount of information we can put on these slides and talk about today. So we've included lots of links that will accompany this module and will be available alongside the recording on the National Adoption Service website. So many of the resources and the slides that we are talking through today will be applicable to both education and health professionals, although there are some that will be specific to each. Feel free to use these resources as you wish, to use the slides as you wish, to pause the recording, to think about things, to reflect on things, to support your learning. In this module today, we'll be focusing on what you need to know about adoption, about the children who were placed for adoption in Wales, and how their early experiences of trauma, including pre-birth trauma, have affected them. Your role in supporting their education and health needs means that you are a really important part of building the brighter future these children deserved. So we'll be thinking of some of the things you are likely to see with children and families in your setting and what really helps them and you. What are we trying to achieve for children? Well, local authorities have a statutory duty to safeguard and promote the welfare of children in care. These children, for whatever reasons, have been unable to live with their families. Local authority social workers are required to develop a care plan for every looked after child that justifies where that child is living whilst being looked after by a local authority, for example, with a foster carer or in a residential setting, and then setting out where the child should be placed to achieve permanence. Now, achieving permanence for children is an underpinning principle of the legislative framework in Wales of all social work practice with children and families, and we are working hard to achieve this as early as we possibly can. And what we mean by permanence is emotional permanence, the opportunity to develop healthy attachment patterns with sensitive and attuned and responsive caregivers. We're talking about physical permanence, that safety and stability that children need, where their needs are met. And we're also talking about legal permanence, being clear about who holds parental responsibility for the child and makes decisions for them now and into their future. And together, all these give a child a sense of security and continuity, commitment and identity and belonging throughout their childhood and for their lifetime. And as social workers, we are always thinking of that little one in front of us, who may be a baby or a very young child, and what their needs are now, but also into the future. Now, for some children, permanence can be achieved through successful return to their family, where it has been possible to address the factors which led to the children becoming looked after. For other children, routes to permanence may include care provided by family and friends, particularly when such care can be supported by a legal order, such as a special guardianship order. Another important route to permanence, particularly for older children, is long-term fostering or maybe residential arrangements, although we need to be clear of the limitations of this, especially as the child reaches adulthood. For a small number of children who are unable to return to their parents or wider family, adoption offers a lifelong and legally permanent new family. So what is adoption? Adoption is a legal process through which the court determines that a child or a group of siblings who cannot be brought up with a birth family can become full, legal and permanent members of a new family. Now, when a child is first placed with their prospective adoptive family, they are still looked after children and are still monitored and reviewed as such. The prospective adopters can then apply to court for an adoption order after the child has been living with them for a minimum of 10 weeks. And after a child is formally adopted, after they have an adoption order granted, he or she is no longer looked after by the local authority and their adoptive parents become fully legally responsible for them. So what you are seeing on the slide in front of you is some details from a report that was published in 2022 that explored the outcomes for children of different permanent options and the value created by adoption to those who are adopted, their families and wider society. And what the analysis and the report confirms is that a child who lives with a family is more likely to experience positive outcomes than those living in care. That adoption brings substantial value to society through permanence, stability and support that it can offer children who cannot live with their birth families. And according to the evidence, adopted children and young people have decreasing reliance on those publicly funded services and support in childhood and later life. They are more likely to be in meaningful work and less likely to be involved in things like criminal activity. But adoption is arguably one of the most drastic interventions as it severs a child's legal ties to their birth family permanently. So the decision to pursue adoption is one of the most complex aspects of a social worker's role. We absolutely recognise that birth parents are often struggling with the impact of the same early trauma that we see in their children, with many complicating factors like unmet mental health needs, or domestic violence, or parents who might have been care leavers themselves. And as social workers, we would always want to see a better balance between support and assessment. Balancing the needs of the child and the parents is really complex. And as social workers, we and the courts are rightly prioritising the needs of the child in striving to protect them, to keep them safe, in making decisions that they can grow up in a family that nurtures them and helps them grow in every sense of the word. Now, adoption legislation is absolutely clear that children are adopted only if the court decides that adoption is in their best interests, or if the parents have properly relinquished their child. It is considered for children where other options have been fully explored, and services work on the clear principle that every effort and support should be provided with the aim to keep families together wherever that is possible. But when this is not possible, when a child cannot remain in their wider family or safely return home from care, adoption provides that legal security, that love and belonging in a family. And it is the only option for some children and has lifelong implications for all those involved. And we know that adoption works when the right support is provided to all those in that adoption triangle that you see on the screen. To the child, obviously, but also to the birth family, to the adoptive family. And we'll be talking more about the lifelong impact of trauma a little bit later on in the presentation. So historically, adoption used to be about finding children for people who couldn't have their own children. So the focus was on the adults, really. But over the years, the concept and legislation of adoption, as well as the practice, has changed considerably. It's now about finding families for children who need a permanent alternative family for life. Often the most vulnerable children in our society who have experienced significant pre- and post-birth developmental trauma, which affects all aspects of their development. Whereas there used to be a complete severance of any form of contact between a child and their family of origin, and no real understanding of a child's need for information and understanding about their identity, a bit like an off with the old, on with the new arrangement, which we now know is hugely damaging for them and does nothing to strengthen the adoptive family or help birth families move forward. Adoption in today's Wales is very different. It now fully acknowledges the need for clear, coherent information to be shared with every child in an age-appropriate way about their family of origin, but also about the reasons why they couldn't stay with them. And this not only helps a child understand what is happening, understand their past, and give them a coherent sense of who they are, it also takes away the blame from the child and enriches that personal view that they have of themselves. As practitioners, we are always thinking about family and relationships and loss and identity and what is right for the child now, but also as they mature, that helps them develop a coherent sense of their identity as an adopted person and respects their multiple relationships that are important to them. Now, this includes providing opportunities for the adults involved to meet each other, to develop empathy for each other, and a relationship based on a shared commitment about what is right for the child. We'll always do our best to keep brothers and sisters together in Wales if this is right for them. And this is a key priority when we are recruiting and assessing prospective adopters. We know how important these sibling relationships are. So adoptive parents are prepared and assessed not only to ensure that they can provide safety and stability, but also to ensure that they can provide the kind of parenting that a child who has suffered developmental trauma needs. Parenting that helps them recover. And we'll be thinking about what this looks like in a bit. What we also recognise is that adoption support is a normative part of adoption. The lifelong journey of families and all the complexity that adoption brings. And in Wales, we are continuing to develop adoption policy and practice in order to support everyone in that adoption triangle. The way we are delivering adoption in Wales changed back in 2015 with the formation of the National Adoption Service for Wales, an innovative, collaborative organisation supported by Welsh Government, which brings together all local authority and voluntary adoption agencies in Wales. It comprises of a small central team that Adele is part of, which facilitates policy and practice development, and which includes the Adoption Register for Wales. And then we have 5 regional collaboratives that you can see on the map there across the 22 local authorities in Wales. But what we also have is a number of voluntary adoption agencies that you can see on the right of your screen. The National Adoption Service also works across other sectors, including health and education, Welsh Government, places like Cardiff University who are doing the Wales cohort study. So one of the key strengths of the National Adoption Service is a multidisciplinary collaboration, bringing organisation in Wales who have contact with and an interest in adopted children and their families together to work in partnership. And one of the strategic roles of NAS is to support the ongoing development of good practice and develop national frameworks that support modern adoption practice and which helps to ensure consistency across Wales. In 2020, NAS launched 4 good practice guides in key areas with additional resources like the Trauma Nurture Timeline and Contact Planning tool. So we have Life Journey Framework for practitioners, foster carers, adoptive parents and birth parents. We have the Adoption Support Framework to ensure that all adoptive families and adopted children and young people can access a range of support services. The Welsh Early Permanence Framework was launched in 2022, the core principle of which is to provide a child with a secure base with permanence as early as possible when days and weeks really do matter, and to minimise unnecessary moves that inevitably cause further trauma. And we're always thinking about the different pieces of the jigsaw we need to get right to make sure that the people who make the decisions about a child's future across their lifetime are fully aware of what adoption looks like in today's Wales. So let's think about the children and what all children need. They need that basic care. They need safety and stability, emotional warmth, stimulation, guidance and boundaries. They need strong parent and child connections that facilitates their growth and development. But we also have to realise and accept that very often parents who are caring for traumatised children can feel very stressed themselves. So these children also need lots and lots of other positive relationships in their wider family, in their community, in school, in clubs, etc., that enable and support their resilience as well as support their parents. So, right from the start of their life, babies are born helpless, and their early hours and days can be extremely stressful. Their survival literally depends on others. So, they are born very cleverly with a natural instinct to connect with other human beings, to establish some degree of control over them at a very early stage. And the behaviours the baby develop in order to get that proximity and help from a carer, like crying and smiling and cooing, etc., are called attachment behaviours. The baby's underdeveloped brain will grow and increase its capacity after birth in response to stimuli. But in those early months, the baby will have no capacity to regulate or manage the stress they feel. The connection with their carer is critical, and an attuned and responsive carer will help to soothe and relax the child by meeting their needs consistently and predictably. And that's really important, that consistency and predictability. This repeated cycle of need and arousal, response and relaxation develops trust between the child and the adult and contributes to the child's developing pattern of managing stimulation and relaxation themselves as they grow older. And other positive interactions that the carer engages in with the child, such as making faces and blowing raspberries, making sounds mirroring them, and being in tune with them, begins that process of helping the child to develop an understanding and pleasure in social interactions and is the beginnings of empathy. Now, the trust that a child develops in their attachment figure will enable them to be confident to explore the world as they grow older, in the knowledge that they will be kept safe. The child will learn from the adult what is okay and what is not okay, and they will feel shame, a completely natural response if the adult indicates that action is unacceptable. But this will actually help a child to learn not to do certain things and consequently stay safe. The carer who helps a child recover quickly after that shame, who restores that broken connection with the child, who reintegrates that child's shame, enables the child to learn from the mistakes and to learn that actually what they do is shameful, but that they themselves are not bad. So, as we see on the slide, babies learn about themselves, they learn about other people, they learn about their world through those repeated interactions with their caregivers. How and if babies' needs are met will have a significant influence on how they understand and make sense of their world. And we know that the first 3 years are so important in setting that foundation for what we call their inner working model. Where there is responsive and attuned caregiving, the child will develop an inner working model that tells them that they are lovable, that they are worthy of care, that the people around them are predictable and safe, and they will meet their needs, that the world is a pretty okay place to be in. These are the children that will find it easier to make transitions, to cope in life, because they have the general belief that it will be okay and interesting for them. They will have faith that somebody will be there if they are hurt and make it okay. Their brain, and we'll be hearing about this later on, their brain is literally programmed to relax, to learn, to explore, and to create relationships. For the child who's experienced security and responsiveness from their parents, who've experienced care and love, their developmental wall will look a little bit like this. From the start, they will have had that attuned care, that love. They will have had their basic needs met with food, with warmth, with comfort. They will have that sense of belonging and understanding and encouragement. They will have had interaction, not only with their immediate caregivers, but with wider family and community. And this will be built on as they grow older. Their wall is pretty solid and secure. So now let's think about why some children need adoption and why their experiences will be very different to those children who have had sensitive, attuned, and responsive adults around them. Adoption has changed significantly over the past 30 years, and the vast majority of children today who become adopted have been removed from their birth family to safeguard their welfare. Developmental trauma is the term used to describe the impact of early repeated trauma and loss, which happens within the child's important relationships and usually early in life. This can arise from what a child experiences, so the different categories of abuse that you can see on the screen, both pre and post birth, so being hit or not fed or ignored or not responded to appropriately, being shouted at, being abused, being subject to parental substance or alcohol misuse or domestic violence or unmet mental health needs within the parents. All these are significant issues that affect children. And it's never one thing. It's usually a compilation of significant events, both acute and long-standing, which interrupt or change or damage the child's physical and psychological development. It never neatly fits into one category, and there's always lots of overlap. But emotional abuse is always a feature of the other categories of abuse. Now, in 2024, 78% of children placed for adoption were between 1 and 4 years old, and 20% were between 5 and 9. All of these children will have experienced some form of loss by being taken into care, and the majority will also have experienced abuse and or neglect. For many children, this can begin in the womb with exposure to alcohol or other substances or to domestic violence. So some adopted children may be at an increased risk of genetic conditions and developmental difficulties. And we know from research that adopted children and young people, because of their early adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are at a higher risk of mental health issues like anxiety, depression, ADHD, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and also an increased risk for suicide. It's important to recognise that early trauma and attachment experiences can affect children who've been taken into care and subsequently adopted. In all cases, for many years after adoption, they may have specific physical and developmental needs around things like forming trusting relationships, managing strong emotions, coping with any form of transition or change, however small. They may have speech and language difficulties or learning delays, sensory processing issues. And we'll be talking about some of these in more detail later on in the presentation. Now, for all the benefits and unique joys that adoption brings, and it does bring many, it is not a magic solution that cures everything. The Wales cohort study by Cardiff University showed that 47% of children placed for adoption experienced at least 4 ACEs before placement, compared to 14% of the general population. So this places them in the highest risk group for later life difficulties, often manifesting at critical transition points in a child's life. And we see this repeatedly in adoption support. Adoption does provide children with opportunities for recovery within safe and nurturing relationships, but the impact of their early experiences does not end with the adoption order. And, as you can see on the quote by John Bowlby, that clearly demonstrates that. The triggers will be there for the rest of their life. But importantly, with that right support, they will get better at managing them. And this is applicable across all settings, across home, school, leisure, and health. For a child who's experienced early trauma, their behaviour will come from learnt strategies and is not always what it seems. From very early on, they've had to work out certain strategies that help them literally survive. And these children can revert to their default position at times when they feel stressed, when they feel anxious or unsafe, even when the triggers are not always obvious to the adults around them. So, as adults, in the home, in the school, in any other setting, we need to understand their behaviour, those hidden needs, and think about what's going on beneath the surface. We need to understand them from a trauma-informed perspective, because through our interactions with these children, we are slowly rewriting the child's understanding and experience of relationships, and that takes time. Adoption UK regularly consults with large numbers of adoptive families across Wales, and many have said they would like professionals across primary and secondary health services and across education to understand more about the challenges they face, including recognising that the use of language in adoption is complex, but also really important and has implications for personal identity. What they have said is that they would welcome more sensitivity about the language used to describe them and their child. Adoptive parents had said they would want professionals to talk about adoption as just another way of which a family can be enjoyed, importantly using those words correctly: birth parents, birth mother, birth father, and not real mother, real father. Adoptive parents talk about the detrimental impact of having to frequently repeat their stories to professionals, reciting constantly known information from their child's birth family medical history. We know that there are likely to be gaps in that known information, and that it can be really difficult to navigate. They want recognition of the impact that early childhood trauma can have on the physical and emotional well-being and presenting behaviour of their children and young people. And as I said earlier, often presenting during key transition points, such as the start or change of school and puberty, but also those minor transition points like moving between classroom, changing teachers, going into break time. Children who have suffered early trauma and loss are often misdiagnosed and misunderstood by professionals, by family and friends, who actually have their best interests at heart, but who don't yet know about the impact of that early trauma. So labels like naughty or behavioural problems can actually lead to adult responses that hold a child back from progressing and developing. Adoptive parents want recognition of the impact of poor and disrupted attachment has on all other relationships, particularly informing new family relationships, but also relationships in school with peers, with people in the community. They want more understanding of health-specific issues, including fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, antenatal substance exposure, and neonatal abstinence syndrome. They want more understanding of what global developmental delay means, where correct diagnosis can ensure a child is supported well throughout their life. And they would like easier access to good trauma-informed services that really help. Now, we are increasingly aware of the impact of trauma on unborn babies. We know from research that a history of severe trauma in parents can even change the unborn baby's genetic makeup. And trauma during pregnancy means that a baby is born hardwired to be oversensitive to life stresses, as well as being physically affected. For example, if a child's birth mother is in a violent relationship and has a chaotic lifestyle, maybe used drugs and alcohol during pregnancy, has a history of trauma herself, maybe suffered serious mental health problems during the pregnancy, or had little or no prenatal care, all these will affect her and her unborn child inevitably. So, with alcohol, if a baby is exposed to alcohol in the womb, they might show signs of FAS or FASD. These could include physical attributes like a smaller head or poor growth or distinctive facial features, but also physical health problems such as hearing and vision problems, or neurodevelopmental problems such as learning difficulties, autism, or ADHD. Most drugs of abuse, such as opioids, amphetamines, marijuana, and nicotine, easily cross the placenta. If a baby is exposed to drugs in the womb, they may experience a range of withdrawal symptoms, collectively known as neonatal abstinence syndrome. Symptoms include tremors, irritability, sleep disturbances, hyperactive reflexes, feeding difficulties, and gastrointestinal problems. As well as this, exposure to drugs in utero can have long lasting implications for fetal growth and brain development, including birth defects, seizures, developmental delay, and learning disabilities. A child who has suffered early trauma and neglect might take longer to reach certain developmental milestones, and some may never achieve them fully. So, research evidence shows a high proportion of premature birth for those mothers and babies where there is social deprivation, high incidence of smoking and mental health problems, and alcohol and drug use during pregnancy. These babies then require higher levels of post birth medical intervention. And all of these have significant effects on a baby's new and developing brain, on their body and sensory systems. And so when health or education services come into contact with a child for the first time, whether that is in nursery, in school, when in contact with health visiting services, as maybe part of a CAMS provision, or anywhere else, they need to know whether a child was born prematurely and their experiences pre-birth and post-birth. This short film gives you some indication of what a child's home might look like, smell like, sound like, and feel like for them. This is not just about a few dirty towels left on the bathroom floor. This is much more than that. So let's have a think about what happens when care isn't readily available, when the adults are unpredictable or absent or scary. A poor early experience for a child can mean that they develop a completely different experience of the world and a different pattern of learning. If their carer is not consistent or appropriate in their response, either through neglect or abuse, the world for these children can feel tough and frightening and confusing, and they feel stress all the time. For these children, their inner working model is much different. They are learning that they need to develop attachment behaviours which literally maximize their chances of survival. That's all they want to do is to survive. But if a baby cannot get the attention they need from their carer, or their carer induces fear, maybe they shout at them or they smack them, as well as comfort, then the baby will not be soothed. They may become very demanding, or very controlling, or very dependent. They are not able to regulate their own stress. And this will leave them having strong reactions to stressful situations or disassociated from them completely. They will become confused about relationships, finding no reward in relationships with others, nor seeing themselves as rewarding in any way. If the adult gives confusing messages about what is right or wrong, or maybe overreacts and then doesn't repair the connection and reintegrate the shame that the child feels, then that child may develop the sense not that they make mistakes, but that they themselves are a mistake, that there is something wrong with them. And this is completely unbearable for them. And Adele will talk more about the impact of this and some of the behaviours you might see, particularly in the classroom later on. An adult who cannot, maybe through their own needs, or does not help a child to manage their emotions as they grow, leaves that child potentially unable to manage or control their own strong feelings. They are not helped to develop patterns through maybe storytelling or games. So they don't get a sense of the difference between what is fact and what is fiction. Nor things like mine and yours and the development of empathy. These children have missed out on those crucially important connections from the start of their life. Connections that should have been well established before they start to explore their world as they get older and before the need for boundaries and discipline to keep them safe in the world. As they grow, these children are much more cautious of others. They don't show their real needs because they don't feel worthy to be responded to. They won't presume that someone will be there to make it better. And all transitions will be tough for these children because they're in a constant state of hyperarousal, of fear. They'd be hypervigilant. The amygdala in their brain, that smoke alarm in their brain, is always on. And that will send messages to the survival part of their brain if they perceive any sort of danger. These children, as with all children, need boundaries and structure and limit setting. They need to learn new patterns of behaviour, but they will not learn this through traditional styles of behaviour management, not because they don't want to, but because they can't. They need connection before correction. And Adele will talk more about this now and some strategies that will work with these children. So for these children who've experienced early childhood trauma, who will not have had the sensitive, responsive caregiver that supported their social and cognitive development, they've missed out on so many things. Their developmental wall will inevitably have lots of gaps and be a bit wonky and unstable and really wobbly. Their experiences will have impacted them. It will have affected all aspects of their development, their emotional regulation, their attachment patterns, their physical and sensory development, their brain development. And we'll have a look at what I mean by this in the next few slides. These children who have experienced early trauma will have spiky profiles in their milestone development. So, for example, they might have really high visual acuity because they've had to be hypervigilant. They've had to be aware of what is happening around them. But they might be limited in their speech and language development or their fine motor skills because they haven't had opportunities to develop these. Children often have a default attachment pattern. They don't have one static attachment style. This helps us to understand why so many vulnerable children are shut down, seen as good at school, yet fall apart at home, or vice versa. It also helps us understand why it can be so hard for professionals to really see what is going on in the child's emotional world, as vulnerable children are so incredible at adapting to their environments. They've had to be.
Now we're going to talk about brain development and the effects of trauma on the brain. Apologies if this feels like a bit of a basic explanation about the brain and the different areas and how they work and relate to each other. You can find lots more useful information about trauma and the brain on the Beacon House website and by listening to people like Bruce Perry and Dan Segal. Links and resources around this will be provided at the end. Over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a really rapid increase in our knowledge of the impact of trauma on the brain and our understanding of how the brain works in relation to environmental factors. It's really helpful to understand this when we're thinking about children's responses, how we respond to them, what works, and what won't work, and most importantly, why. So, essentially, the brain develops from the bottom up. All babies are born with a formed brain, but this is underdeveloped and continues to develop post-birth. This doesn't happen independently and is in response to the stimuli and experiences that we give that brain. So the brain can very simply be divided into three parts. The first part is the brain stem, our reptilian or primitive brain, and our midbrain comes under that as well. This part of the brain is responsible for core things that we do and take for granted in our day-to-day life, like breathing, heart rate, temperature control. The midbrain is also a relay system for transmitting information that's necessary for vision and hearing. It's also responsible for motor movement, pain, and our sleep-wake cycles. It takes in a lot of our sensory motor input, and this will become really important later when we talk about sensory development and some of the deficits that happen in that as a result of trauma. The second part of the brain we're going to chat about is the limbic brain. This part of the brain is responsible for processing and regulating emotion. It's responsible for memory and stress responses. By stress responses, we mean involved in the fight, flight, freeze, flop, or fawn responses that can be triggered when we're in danger. It's also really important and vital in making attachment to our caregivers. The final part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the cortex, the cortical brain. This is where the thinking, learning, logic, problem-solving aspects of the brain happen. This is the area where we control behavior and have impulse control. Babies are using their primitive and limbic brain to function and survive. They're learning and developing through and because of their relationships with others. As we continue to grow and develop through repeated experiences, our conscious thoughts begin to take control. This happens in our cortical brain, that third part of the brain that I spoke about. This leads us to making decisions, choices that affect our actions and behaviors. But crucially, this is based on experience and our insights and knowledge that we've gained from that experience. So the staircase, as we call it, between the upstairs brain, that cortical thinking brain, and the downstairs more primitive brain is usually well practiced and worn for those of us that had a pretty good start in life. And this means that in situations we perceive as threatening or dangerous, the majority of the time, our upstairs brain can override the instinctive response of our downstairs brain. This prevents us from flipping our lid, which means we can bring our thinking brain back online. Dan Segal talks about this extremely well, and I'll share a link to a short video about this at the end. For those children where they haven't had safe, responsive, predictable care, this staircase between the upstairs thinking brain and the downstairs primitive brain is less well developed. They find it much harder, if not nearly impossible, to stay in control or regulate the effects of the downstairs brain. This isn't because they don't want to, this is because they can't. They get triggered much quicker by sensory or motor input, like loud voices, changes or transitions, even smells. They need help to regulate their brain and body, and they can only do this alongside others over time in relationship with others. This helps them to shift into their upstairs thinking or reasoning part of the brain. Let's think about why this happens and the effects on the brain of increased production of the stress hormone cortisol. A baby with responsive caregivers trusts that they will keep them safe and know that they're going to respond when they need them. This frees up the baby to relax, concentrate on learning, developing, exploring, without worrying about survival. This produces a profile of neurotypical development, where the downstairs brain is appropriately less developed, allowing the upstairs brain to grow. If a baby, however, is in an environment that is dangerous, there's loud noises, strange people, they have a non-responsive or sometimes scary caregiver, there's lots of chaos, they might be stuck in a cot or high chair for long periods of time and not getting any sensory or relational input. This type of trauma interrupts brain development and pushes it off track, resulting in the profile we see on the right. Very cleverly and sensibly, the baby's brain responds to their experience by growing the survival part of their brain to keep themselves safe. This is an appropriate and normal adaptation. However, we find that this adaptation lasts even when the baby's environment changes and becomes safer later on. And this provides us with an explanation of why we see some of these survival instincts kicking in environments we wouldn't always expect them to. When the brain is responding to high alert, the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, are pumped around the body. What you see in children where this has become the norm, because that's the type of environment they're living in every day, they seem restless, hyperactive, unable to concentrate, even irritable. For some children, such levels of stress are overwhelming and the child will go into shutdown. They'll sleep a lot or they'll totally dissociate. Traumatic events lead to increased production of the hormone called cortisol, which can lead to destruction of neurons and synapse formation in the brain. So essentially, the connections are not forming as we want them to. Chronically high levels of cortisol can lead to cognitive, motor, and social delay. Other hormones are key to brain development, such as serotonin and noradrenaline. Serotonin aids management of emotion, including aggression, and noradrenaline regulates responses to fear and anger. Therefore, exposure to trauma upsets the balance of these emotions, resulting in a range of behavioral, emotional, and cognitive difficulties. Abusive and/or neglectful environments can cause chronic stress, and this in turn can impair brain development. As well as trauma, for some of the children that we've already talked about who've been adopted, we also need to think about the impact of preterm birth on the developing brain and nervous or sensory system. Children who have been born prematurely are at increased risk of having long-term health conditions and disabilities as a result. So now we're going to talk about the survival part of the brain, the fight, flight, freeze response that we talked about earlier. And I'm going to introduce one that perhaps not everyone will have heard of, which is fawn. The problem for traumatized children is that when they transition into a safe environment, the primitive brain doesn't turn off. It's still responding in high alert, and the stress hormones are still pumping around the body. Just because we tell children that they're safe doesn't mean they'll believe it or feel it in their brain and body immediately. The bottom line is, a child who does not feel safe primarily lives in their fight, flight, freeze response part of the brain. They're not always able then to access their upstairs thinking part of the brain. So most people will know and understand what we mean by fight, flight, or freeze. But I'll talk a little bit about what those might look like in the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about this fawn response. These are the children you'll see in your settings who are people pleasers, they're overly compliant, they're masking their true selves, and they're making themselves as likable and as agreeable as possible to get positive adult feedback. So this might look like a child in the classroom who wants to help all the time, they're wanting to be very close to the teacher. They might also be the child that's very quiet at the back of the class, that doesn't want to ask for help or present any sort of difficulty. They might always say that they're okay. In school, these children will not be perceived as a problem as they are overly compliant. However, at home, these same children can display a whole range of different behaviour. Overt signs of distress, including anger, anxiety, and controlling behaviour. Helen talked earlier about the fact that the same child can present differently at different times. For this child that I just spoke about, the home and relationships they have might be a secure base where they're starting to feel truly safe and therefore willing to show some vulnerability. This often takes a long time after moving to their new home in adoption, and it takes a lot of time and sensitive effort from their adoptive parents. Now we'll talk a little bit more about what's going on inside the brain and body for a child when they're experiencing these survival responses. So fight might look like a child that's hot, bothered, aggressive, angry, defiant, demanding. But inside, they're feeling scared, alone, bad, worthless. Behind a lot of anger, there's usually a lot of fear. Flight might look like keeping busy, running away, hyperactive, repeatedly wanting to go to the toilet, hiding. But inside, they'll often be feeling panicky, tense, sick, or worried. Freeze might look a lot like not interested, bored, clumsy, forgetful, not listening, or slow to respond. but inside they're often feeling deeply anxious, frozen, their heart is racing, and they're very disconnected from the people and things around them. Fawn could encompass all of these responses, particularly freeze, and again can be easily misinterpreted on the outside as a child coping and looking fine. Now we're going to chat a little bit more about shame. Helen touched on this earlier. We talk about this because it's a really important part of the reason why we see different behaviour from adopted children and young people. When we talk about children and their experiences of developmental trauma, we also need to talk about shame and the huge impact it has for a child's view of themselves and the world that they live in, and how it can help us understand the presenting behaviour, but also what's going on underneath. Shame is a natural response. We all feel it from a very young age. For children who've experienced sensitive, responsive caregiving, shame is a temporary feeling. It's triggered when a child is told off, and the attuned caregiver then heals that momentary break in the relationship. This can be felt as quite shocking and scary for the child at the time, but the caregiver helps them to move out of that state quite quickly. Repeated experiences of this helps to gradually teach children which behaviours are acceptable and unacceptable, but that they themselves are a good enough person. As children get older, through the support of their caregiver, their understanding develops and feelings of shame evolve into feelings of guilt. In contrast to shame, guilt can be motivating to repair a situation where distress has been caused to others. Through feelings of guilt, confidence and self-esteem can be developed based on the realization that the child can successfully correct their mistakes. So, as we said, for those children who have experienced early developmental trauma, who may have not experienced a sensitive caregiver that supported their development, they'll have missed out on so many things. They'll have missed out on the positive messages given to them about the mistakes that they made and how they themselves are a good person within that. Many will have experienced a shaming parenting style from the start, which programs the child's brain with feelings of insecurity, perhaps not feeling lovable, feeling invisible, or not worthy of care. These children often live with a core sense of being a mistake or being bad. This creates a painful, deep-rooted, subconscious feeling of feeling worthless. And these children will subsequently try to cover up any vulnerabilities that may expose their perceived imperfections. It takes a great degree of vulnerability to admit that we've done something wrong. We have to feel okay enough about ourselves as people to do that. And that's what these children who have gone through early trauma are missing. Here we look at the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is something that we want children to develop when they don't do things that are okay or right, which is a normal part of development. We want them to learn through their mistakes and learn through repairing the situations that led to their mistake. Shame is a really powerful, all-encompassing feeling that we don't want children to feel stuck in for any length of time. So for an insecurely attached child, they'll often seek out those negative responses that they believe that they deserve. This is their pattern or script that they've developed through their early attachment relationships with their caregivers. They'll try to replicate that with any other adults who are providing an attachment relationship at that time. Therefore, these traditional behaviour management approaches don't often fit or work for these children because they reinforce the child's negative inner working model and sense of themselves. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So now we're going to talk a little bit about shame and the types of behaviours that we'll see in real life in response to a child trying to minimise that feeling of shame. I'm sure in your settings, whether that's health or education, you'll have seen these behaviours play out. For children, feeling shame can be incredibly painful for a child to experience. It's a rupture in the relationship, and it feels like that can't be healed at the time. It also makes them feel bad about themselves. This is even harder for children to tolerate when they've experienced early developmental trauma and they've not learned to regulate their emotions, and they have a hyperactive survival brain being triggered. To try and avoid these feelings, a child, even as young as 2, will employ different tactics as a way to deflect and minimize that feeling within themselves. Denying or lying about what they've done or what's happened is a way to do that. This often creates conflict and disrupts the relationship further, but it gives the child a shield to not feeling those painful feelings of shame. Another strategy that children use is blaming others. This is often when children are deflecting away from what they've done. It's when a child might have heightened anxiety about what they've done and fear of being judged for it. Another shield of shame behaviour would be minimising their role in what's happened. This could involve avoiding apologising to minimise their role in what's happened. Another common shield of shame behaviour is rage. A child experiences heightened anger or aggression as a way to deflect from those shameful feelings of feeling bad about not only what they've done, but them as a person. So with all of these shield of shame behaviours, whether that's denying what they've done, lying about it, which we find it really hard to tolerate as adults, whether it's blaming others or minimising their role in it, or whether it's rage or aggression, this often leads to responses from adults that reinforce the shame, that reinforce the child's feeling of themselves as being bad, and we get stuck in these negative cycles of interacting. So when we talk to adoptive parents about children's behaviour and how they present, we explain about this is inextricably linked to their behaviour and how they present. Being with children is being in a reciprocal relationship with them. How we think, feel, and respond affects how they think, feel, and respond, and vice versa. And this is what this cycle conveys. We need to keep this in mind when we're responding to children in the moment. Empathy for them when their behaviour is really hard to deal with can be very, very difficult, whether that's in health or education settings or at home as a parent. However, these children and their behavioural responses will take up a lot of your time and effort anyway. So learning to respond and thinking about how we respond in a different way can really disrupt those negative cycles that we spoke about before. Responding in a different way from us as adults often elicits a different response in the child. It's often really difficult for us as adults to respond to the child in front of us in that moment. We can be thinking about the child's chronological age or even their cognitive age, what they're able to do in terms of their learning. And this can be markedly different from their developmental or emotional age. And responding to the child where they're at that moment in time is really important. So, how do we respond to a child who experiences these feelings of shame? Firstly, it's really important to recognise that traditional behavioural approaches like star charts and reward schemes do not work with traumatised and insecurely attached children. And they often further feed into an ongoing cycle of shame and are a visual reminder of the way in which they view themselves as bad. Those strategies like star charts, timeout, sending children off to sit on their own to think about what they've done, only work where a child understands an adult to be a trustworthy, reliable, and unconditionally supportive person in their lives. The relationship is key to these strategies working, and the sense that the child has of themselves and other people. This is why the same strategies don't work when children have not experienced their caregiver in this manner. They actually do more harm by entrenching behaviour that's a communication of the internal distress that that child is feeling, rather than a deliberate attempt to be naughty or defiant. Charts and schemes often also set these traumatised children up to fail. Often it's a skill and regulation deficit issue rather than a deliberate attempt to be difficult, naughty, or disruptive. The good behaviour is often unachievable for them due to toxic shame and living in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. They can also cause conflict with the child's inner working model. The child then chooses to stay on the bad side as that fits the narrative that they already have of themselves anyway. The child believes they're bad in any case, So seeing other children succeeding reinforces their sense of failure and badness. Therefore, any adult response that doesn't promote that connection or disrupts the relationship leads to a negative response often from the traumatized child and doesn't help them to develop a new pattern of positive relationships with other people. Now we're going to talk a little bit about sensory processing and sensory development. So the brain and central nervous system are at the center of everything that makes us human. They work together to help us make sense of the world we live in, and they give us the tools to be able to relate, move, play, think, plan, and participate in relationship with other people. Children in loving, nurturing families have lots of movement and emotional experiences that allow their brain and nervous system to develop strong pathways and be able to move easily through developmental stages. Chatting with a small baby, giving it lots of eye contact, having that back and forth interaction with it, as well as lots of opportunities to move, like wriggling, lifting them up, moving them around, reaching out to them. These movements, alongside the interaction, are really important in building pathways in the brain and central nervous system that form the foundations for the development of emotional and social skills later on, as well as sensory motor capabilities. Cwtches or cuddles don't just provide that feel-good moment, they also build pathways in the brain that will allow the child to think before they act as they get bigger. We would call this impulse control. Children who've experienced early trauma have missed out on early movement experiences, both in the womb and in those early days and weeks. This could include being trapped in seats, poor feeding experiences, lack of interaction and eye contact and nurturing care. They don't have the lovely warm interactions and all the movement experiences that go with them. While babies may protest for some time when they are left on their own, after a time they give up and go into a kind of despair. In this state, the baby hardly moves at all. A baby lying in a cot who has given up hope that someone will come and help them and meet their needs will show some small self-soothing movements, such as moving their head from side to side, but they won't be doing the big whole arm, whole leg excited movements that we see, for example, when we're talking to a baby and having a positive interaction with them. This results in less sensory motor input and, as a result, less sensory motor development for these babies. On a physical level, these children will then often have difficulties with regulation as they develop. They'll struggle to tune into the messages their body is giving them about how they're feeling or reacting and use this information to make decisions about what they're going to do. They might be too loud, too fast. They might be not as agile as others. They might be more clumsy, bump into things, have less spatial awareness of where they are in relation to other people or things. They will often struggle with things like using cutlery or handwriting that requires those fine motor skills. When we look more closely, we notice that it's not just their hands that don't work very well. Their arms and shoulders aren't as strong as we would expect them to be, and their core doesn't hold them as strongly as it needs to. When children have missed early movement experiences, they also weren't able to do the more complicated things as they get older, like recognize how they're feeling inside, or even more basic things like recognizing whether they're hungry or full, hot or cold, thirsty or not. We call this interoception. As part of the resources pack that comes alongside this e-learning module, there's a link to how to develop interoception skills within the classroom, if that's the setting that you work within. So, what can help? To help, we have to look carefully at the sorts of things that typically occur during infancy and early childhood and understand how the brain is shaped by these. For example, babies who spend lots of time on their tummies when they're awake generally develop better head, shoulder, and neck control later. Repeated experiences of lying on their tummies builds and strengthens the pathways between the muscles they need to use to hold that position, and the brain and central nervous system that allows them to do that. If the child doesn't lie on their tummy, those connections and pathways aren't built in the same way. Strong muscles in these areas are the foundations for the next stage of development. For example, learning to roll over. And the next one after that, supporting your own weight on your hands and knees, then learning to crawl, then cruising, then walking. Control literally develops from the head downwards. So if there's been gaps in their ability and chance to learn these skills as they're developing, then they'll find some of the later skills more difficult to acquire. Understanding this helps us work out how to use movement to try and build some of these pathways within the brain that would normally be laid down early on in a child's life. Children who have experienced abuse and neglect have often not had these foundation experiences of sensory motor development. It's possible to look at how the child moves and acts in their day-to-day life now and put this together with what we know of the child's early experiences to help us think about how we can go back and redo some of those important early experiences that they missed out on. This can make a huge difference for children's physical, social, emotional development and their learning. So now we move on to what can we practically do in schools or education settings to meet the needs of these traumatized children that we've been talking about. So we've got some ideas around some whole school interventions and then some more targeted interventions for individual children. In terms of whole school interventions, it's helpful to think about using relational rather than behavioural practices and policies. So using non-demanding cooperative language, thinking about the tone that adults use and about how regulated adults are within that setting, thinking less about the reward and punishment aspects that I talked about earlier, and more about ways that build connection between the children and the adults in that school. Also thinking about the whole school environment, thinking about uniform, classroom setups, timetabling, and the effects that those have on the sensory experiences of children and young people, and therefore the behaviour they display as a result of that. I'm also going to talk more later about the neurosequential model of education, where we use a 3-step model for intervening and supporting children. This includes helping them regulate, relating to them within the relationship between you and the child, and then accessing that reasoning, thinking part of their brain. It can also be really helpful as a whole school or whole class to think more about movement or regulating activities. Helping a child to regulate is important to keep topped up through the day, not just to do it in the moment when the child is dysregulated. These movement regulating activities and mindfulness type of activities can be incorporated into everyday school life. In terms of more targeted interventions, building a team around the child that prioritizes long-term relationships with key staff is really important. Key people that can offer connection to the child regularly makes a huge difference in how that child feels when they're in school. We suggest building a team of around 5 key people around the child so that one member of staff is hopefully available at any given time for that child. We acknowledge that there's going to be changes of staff may be busy in the moment, and supporting the child as a whole school system is really important rather than having all of that pressure on 1 or 2 individuals. For those people that have been identified within that team, to really notice, value, and check in with that child is really important. The importance of knowing that there's an emotionally available, safe adult can also be represented visually for the child so that the child can understand who those people are and really buy into that support system around themselves. It's also really important for school staff to buy into this too, and for other staff not in the child's team to also be aware of the child and what their colleagues might be doing to help them. When it comes to these children that you're working with, We need to need them. We can't expect too much of a response from them, and the onus has to be on the adult to reach out to the child. These children don't have a good blueprint of being in relationships in a positive way with adults, so we need to offer them that and build on that with them as we go along. Things to think about when developing the child's team are things like, who does the child interact with most? Who does the child go to when they're unsure or dysregulated? Who helps the child to calm down? It's also important to remember non-teaching staff in this. For example, receptionists, dinner ladies, lollipop ladies. Some of these people can really offer that feeling to the child of being seen, noticed, and valued when they're within that school community. Also, remember to think about the geography of these key people in relation to the school, rooms where they're going to be versus where the child is going to be. Can the child get to their key people easily? It's important to keep establishing and maintaining these key relationships with the child. And once again, the onus needs to be on the adults, not the child, to offer that check-in. Another targeted intervention is transition planning. All adopted children would benefit from enhanced transition planning and relationship building in advance of transitions and after transitions have taken place. Preparing for small and big transitions really benefits adopted children. Concrete plans on return to school after any breaks or transitions are essential, as well as evidencing that the key adults within that school environment keep that child in mind during breaks or transitions, such as little notes that the child can have that show that the staff are still thinking of them whilst they're in school holidays. Protected lunchtime arrangements where they get some access to safe, considerate, caring staff is really important. Access to nurture groups and other safe spaces. Using visual aids and pre-visits when any transition's coming up so that the child can experience that new setting, class, or teacher as many times as possible is really important. This is also important when you're preparing children for things like school trips, and it's also really important to practice positive endings with these children. These children will have experienced a huge amount of loss of relationships through their lives. So a positive ending where they can see that someone can still care about them even after they finish being in their class, for example, is really important. Another intervention is ensuring that home-school communication is robust and is working well. A communication book that's non-judgmental and collaborative between teaching staff and parents is really important. You can communicate what's going on in school and they can communicate what's going on at home. And it's important to hold in mind that those two experiences might be really different, and that's okay. That might be down to all the factors that we've spoken about before. In terms of targeted interventions, it's also important for support to be flexible. It needs to be consistent but not rigid, because the child and their needs will change over time. Also, children may require the most support during unstructured time. Unstructured time is often where adopted children can feel most dysregulated. So that might be break, lunchtime, after school. So building in some support around those times can be really helpful. Now we're going to talk a bit about the neurosequential model of education. So you can see on the right-hand side the diagram for this model. Essentially, we always start in our interactions with children with making sure that they are regulated. That regulation comes from the sensory input from inside their body, that interoception, and the sensory input from outside their body. When a child is then regulated, we can use our relationship with them to offer that child connection and empathy. Only then can we progress to the reasoning, thinking part of the brain, where we support the child to reflect and learn from what's happened. This then links nicely to the reflect repair part of the diagram, which helps a child move from shame into guilt. It helps them repair any relationships that got damaged by their behavior and make amends for any things like damaged objects, etc. It's important to note that you might need to go around this cycle more than once with a dysregulated child, or you might need to move up and down through the different stages. It's not a linear process. So in terms of regulation, the reason we start with that is that a child can't learn or reflect when they're in the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. So their psychological stress responses need to be calmed first. It's important to note here that you might not always know why a child has become dysregulated. It can be tied often to their early trauma experiences, and you might not have a sense of what those are completely. That's okay. It's just about noticing when they become dysregulated and also noticing what helps them to regulate. Stress brings on a pattern of psychological responses. For example, becoming hyper aroused, jumpy, agitated, explosively angry, or hypo aroused, depressed, withdrawn, frozen. We can help them calm their fight, flight, freeze responses and therefore gain control of their emotions and that thinking part of their brain. No one can learn to regulate without first experiencing co-regulation. So we as adults offer that co-regulation to the child so that they can build up their capacity to help them to regulate how they feel in the moment. That takes time and lots of practice. It's also important to note that you need to be regulated yourself to offer that regulation to the child. So you need to feel calm, steady, grounded, empathic in that moment, which is much easier said than done. You then can become the stress regulator for the child and offer soothing but very limited words in the moment. So when we're regulating the child's body and brain, this isn't the time for lots of talking. We want to comfort and reassure them, but not go into any lengthy discussion or explanations, even if we're offering empathetic words. We want to provide or create a safe space for them, allow them time to process and recover, use quiet tones, make sure they're comfortable, thinking about their sensory tolerances and needs there, as well as their physical needs. It can also be a time to use playful approaches that bring down the emotional temperature. We can use safety cues and reduce or remove stress triggers. For example, if the child is distressed, you could need to manage them in the moment by using breath work, brainstem calmers, movement. Novelty also rewires the brain. So if we do something unexpected, that can also bring the child out of that dysregulation. There will be resources at the end of this module on ideas for regulation that you can use within the classroom or within any other setting that you work within. Then we move on to relate. So connection is the next step in helping to calm their nervous system. When we're around people who care about us and we trust, our bodies produce a hormone called oxytocin. This hormone is the opposite of cortisol in that it's responsible for calming our nervous system after stress. This relational regulating effect can only happen with key trusted adults for the child. You can use your relationship to help them feel safe, connected to, and you can attune to them emotionally. Felt safety cues include smiling, tone of voice, and body language. There's a lot of research that shows that a neutral face, children who've experienced trauma interpret as actually being angry or negative. So, if anything, we have to be more over the top in our relational cues that we give to children, that we are okay in our relationship with them, that we're happy with them, that we're not viewing them negatively. We can say things like, we will find a way to get through this together. Relational regulation does not involve us solving the child's distress, only sitting alongside them within it. We can use the power of noticing and naming the emotion for them, such as, I can see you're frustrated, upset. No wonder you're angry. No wonder you're worried or sad when that's happened. We can validate their feelings, but not the behavior. Remember, we aren't moving on to the behavior or that reasoning part at this point. This step in the sequence is supported by building trust with the child during the periods when they are regulated. creating an ethos which recognises the importance of mistakes for learning, and we can model that self-compassion. We can model making mistakes and doing repair. We can also talk about parts of a child, a happy part, upset part, angry part, instead of seeing their behaviour as inherently good or inherently bad and communicating it in that way to them. So the next stage we can then move into is reason, which is the part as adults we usually want to go to quite quickly. Once a child feels calmer, once they're regulated and they feel connected to us within the relationship, we can help them learn new ways to manage their behaviour when they have strong emotions or feelings. We can support them to explore strategies that may help them to find calm and even practice some of those strategies. It's important to say that we need to practice those strategies when they are regulated, not when they're dysregulated, because that's the time they won't be able to access that bit of the brain to help them think about what they need to do. And then, hopefully, over time and repeated experiences of this, next time they feel those emotions, they'll have helpful strategies to rely on. We can encourage them to tell their story. We can support them to remember and reflect on what happened. We can actively listen to the child. We can help them understand their feelings and behaviour in a non-judgmental way, and help them know that negative emotions are normal and that there are ways of expressing them that don't harm others or themselves. If necessary, we can also help them to reinterpret the situation or reframe it. We can then work on the reflect repair part of the model. So finally, when we get to the reflect repair stage of the diagram, we can think about repairing relationships that might have been damaged when the child was dysregulated, rebuilding trust and opening lines of communication again. This encourages them to be responsible for their own behaviour and be a part of resolving the situation. However, rarely is one person fully responsible for an incident, so a restorative approach that allows all parties to take responsibility for their own part in that can be really helpful. This also allows them and others affected to get back into their routine and be ready to learn again. We can use words like think together to help them find a way to repair and restore the situation and reconnect with others. So we can use the following 4 questions to sit alongside the child and work out what we can do to repair what's happened. For example, we can ask 1, what happened, including their thoughts and feelings about that. How have others been affected? Number 2. Number 3, what things need to happen now to fix things? And number 4, how can we help them repair the situation together? Finally, we need to avoid asking why they did something, as often that can lead to the child feeling more shame and becoming dysregulated again. So now we're going to move on to what can help when children and young people come into contact with health services. So we've spoke a little bit about what can help in educational settings. So now we're going to talk a little bit about health settings. So we know the link between ACEs, or developmental trauma, and physical and mental health outcomes from the seminal ACEs research. Research has also shown that trauma is inextricably linked to neurodiversity and mental health, as well as physical health. Therefore, knowing and seeking out information about a child's trauma history is very important when they come into contact with health services. It's also important to note that lots of children within the population of adopted children will not only have experienced trauma and ACEs, but also have a higher likelihood of having a neurodevelopmental condition or a mental health condition. There's lots of extra information and resources around the research on this, which we'll put into the resources section that accompanies this module. So we need to be aware early on in contact with a family with an adopted child of the likely needs and difficulties given their early developmental trauma, so that the system is open to listening to parents and accepts that this cohort of children will likely need additional support from services. We also need to think about how trauma-informed the system is, as well as the people the child or young person is going to see. We need to individualise the service or system offer rather than pushing forward with standard interventions and timescales. They need to take into account the child and family's individual needs and circumstances. Adopted children and young people often take longer to trust and open up to adults and build relationships. They also often need longer term and more in-depth support, as well as greater flexibility in how or where they meet and engage with the health professional. They need to be given time and options to engage rather than shutting the door if they cannot manage to engage with the service meaningfully on a first or even second attempt. For adopted children and young people, we need the mental health focus to be more on prevention than crisis. These children will also come into contact with health services before they are born, sometimes very late in pregnancy. But there are certainly things that would help at that time in terms of health service input, which I'll go on to talk about in the next slide. So it's really important in health settings and for health professionals, such as antenatal services, midwives, paediatricians, and health visitors, to gather detailed alcohol and drug profile usage for both parents across all stages of the pregnancy and in those early days and weeks in terms of the child's neonatal abstinence, etc. This can include observations of alcohol and drug misuse, not just testing. This information becomes really important when we're thinking about the long-term impact of these pre-birth experiences on a child's development and for future diagnoses of conditions like FASD. This can also include evidence of any drinking or drug taking in the home, things like cans, bottles, drug paraphernalia, etc. And it's also really important to note clearly any information about prescription medication that the mother is taking through pregnancy, because this can also have an impact on the child's development later on in life.
So, as I said earlier, for all the huge benefits and unique joys that adoption brings, it's not a magic solution that cures everything. And parenting a child who has experienced early trauma can be tough and exhausting, as well as completely joyous. We often talk about being child-centred, don't we? And the child's needs being the most important. But we absolutely cannot forget the needs of the parents as well, who are responding to the child's needs day in, day out, often in very challenging situations. There are no adopters that I know would say that their needs are more important to the child, and that is really important, but we cannot forget them. We know that post-adoption depression and secondary trauma are now very well recognised in adoptive parents. So it's important for us, whoever we are, when we come into contact with adoptive parents, not to blame or pathologise them essentially for what has happened to their children before they even met them. We need to be thinking about our language. We need to be respectful and consistent. We need to be collaborative with the parents, whilst also keeping in mind the safeguarding aspects of all our positions. And we absolutely have to acknowledge the impact on you as professionals as well. At the end of the day, this is all about relationships. Relationships can be challenging and tiring and exhausting, which is why our next slide brings together some top tips about what we've talked about today. So it's about thinking about the different types of families and showing this in your classroom, in your health settings. Think about relationships, those connections that help a child regulate through their relationship with you before you get to the reasoning and repair part, the correction. We need to always be wondering, which is different than asking the why question. I wonder what is happening for this child. What are they thinking and feeling? Because as Adele said, how we think and feel connects and supports a child's thinking and feeling and moving on in those relationships. We need to be aware of children's early experiences and their multiple identities that are not separate, but as part of a whole of who they are. That integration of their birth identity and their adopted identity as one, and being sensitive to this in our activities in the classroom, in the health settings, and in the language we use to name people and their roles with that child. We need to listen to children, but we also need to listen and work together with families to develop those relationships that enable trust, that enable them to be vulnerable with us and be honest about what is going on, what is happening, in order to move forward with a positive solution that supports positive outcomes. And I think really importantly, we need to give it time. We know that change can and does happen, but it does take time. Our choice of an egg timer with those grains of sand is quite apt here, because it is about those individual grains, those tiny bits of interaction that build to make such a difference. And although it is really hard, and although you are facing multiple pressures, increasing complexity and demand, you do need to make sure that you have support yourself. You do need to make sure that you find ways to keep yourself as regulated as you possibly can in order to be able to help and support a child to become regulated. Thank you very much for listening to Adele and I. And just a reminder, there's a whole range of some key resources that sit alongside this module that you will find on the NAS website.